was the impetus behind Galaxy Black? That is an expansive question. I will start with what I'm going to call universal. Roughly 2012, 2011, 2012, 2013, I was interested to the point of pursuing the possibility of getting the rights to the old SPI Universe RPG from 1981, and doing not exactly a new edition, but a new edition in the same sense that Goblinoid Games Starships and Spacemen Second Edition is a new edition. It is a new edition, but it is also fundamentally kind of a different game. Because I loved the sort of gritty hard science take on things, even though it uses psionics and navigators to do hyperjumps and stuff. I really liked it though. It was a distinctive thing. I really liked the aesthetics of a lot of the old SPI stuff, which is why the aesthetics from the Redmond Simonson Star Force games are such a big influence on the Navigators in Galaxy Black. They're actually more of an influence than Navigators from Dune, for example, although that's kind of the other example. But anyway, but I was really into doing this sort of second edition of Universe, and I was working on its own system and lore and everything, such that when a year or two later I actually got my hands, speaking of which, got my hands on, the second edition of Starships and Spacemen, I kind of took all the background information I generated and glommed it on to that game to flesh out the very bare bones campaign setting in there, because it's Star Trek. But at any rate, so I generated all this material. I had a system, everything, and I did actually eventually hear back from. I don't even remember. It was a long rabbit hole to pursue, but I got a hold of somebody that I thought was the right holder, and I did actually hear back from this person, and they had two pieces of information to me that were very pertinent. One is that no, they weren't. This was not something that was going to happen. Two, I was the second RPG creator to reach out to them with such a idea, proposal, request in recent memory. I don't remember the exact words they used. But that was enough to make me go, okay, I'm on to something. So time passes, and set that aside for a moment, because that's an element that kind of gets folded into this later. We then get into my personal take on some of the, this is going to be somewhat controversial, metaphysics baked into OD&D. One of the more interesting through lines of the appendix in the literature, and conversely, fantasy gaming in general, is the ever-present but invisible hand of a person from the 19th century we know as Madame Blavatsky, who is go to Wikipedia and look up Theosophy. I'm not going to try to do that justice here, except to say that the weird artifact of cultural appropriation that she created, or was responsible for the lower generation of, for lack of a better term, influenced so many of the Appendix N authors, chief among them Edgar Rice Burroughs. The various races of Mars in the solar system are her Blavatsky's root races. Full stop. They're not even riffs. They're just those. But so many like things that are, I think most people would recognize as undercurrents to most Western pop cultural occultism, astral projection, ghosts, this, that, and the other. Almost all of it, especially the stuff that, among other people, Gary Gygax tapped into when they were writing mostly AD&D, because ODD didn't really have anything like this, nothing special anyway. But when all of that was put into the game and rationalized and expanded and given lore and whatnot, all of that stuff crept in. And plus a bunch of weird American esoteric spiritualism, but that's another matter. So you have this weird through line to something that is generally better known as the seed that gave the world, I'm walking a very thin line here, the New Age. I'm talking about the New Age section of the bookstore here. And I'm not bashing, I'm not endorsing, that's what we're talking about. Because everything Blavatsky did seems to have been the kernel for a lot of that stuff. I'm choosing my words very carefully here. I'm trying to be very neutral, objective here. And that stuff is shot through Howard, Lovecraft, the works, for good and bad. This carries with it a lot of baggage, unfortunately. And in 2025, some of that baggage is necessary to call out. I'm not sure what I can contribute to that particular conversation in this environment, aside from acknowledging that it exists. And I guess as a brief aside, there's not a thing I'm interested in that doesn't have some sort of what is the term that we're using today? Questionable or problematic elements. It's just who I am. The stuff I like tends to have those elements. I am aware of them, and I try very hard not to traffic in them, because, Nazis are bad, okay? Xenophobia, however, is generally just don't. But it's important that when you're dealing with any of that material that you are aware of what you're dealing with. Because there's no reason to chuck it whole cloth, but by the same token, you need to understand a lot of the appendix and stuff. I did not mean to go on a tangent like this, but a lot of it comes from not the best places in terms of morality and ethics, in terms of as we understand it today. And I'm not trying to be all comfortable relevant about that, but I am going on a tangent. So, if you remember the 70s, you may remember, likely will, this wonderful, weird little show called In Search Of. Functionally, it was Leonard Nimoy collecting a big fat check every week to legitimize a lot of New Age stuff. Say whatever you want about that. I grew up watching it. It had Spock in it, of course I watched it. In part because of the very, how shall I say, free-thinking household I grew up in. There's mild sarcasm there, but only mild. I was exposed to a lot of stuff, and I'm glad I was, but among the tamer stuff was In Search Of, and one of the things that's interesting about In Search Of, especially now to me, where it's a culture artifact and not a product of the current time, is the very sincere way in which they, in a cheesy sort of way, scienced all of it. They didn't really, but they thought they were, and that was their intention. And it kind of played into kind of a primitive version of the kind of mental picture we have nowadays of like ghost hunters and stuff. But this was something I encountered as a kid. At the same time, I was really getting into science fiction and, especially the literary side of it, this, that. And because a lot of this stuff in the 70s, especially in the 70s sci-fi kind of subgenre of things, often presented some of this woo stuff as more feasible, possible, non-fantastical. That kind of, at the time, of course, caused some bleed over. I know better now, obviously, but the real world is not what we're talking about. We're talking about, worlds of magic and sorcery and this, that. And in that environment, that's a perfectly fine place to explore stuff like that. And so, I think the original injection of this into Galaxy Black came from the idea of a planet where all of the New Age stuff worked. Because at some point when I was doing my deep dive into stuff, I found all of the episodes of In Search Of on YouTube, and I just cracked out on those for I think it was the summer 2015. I just watched all of them. That and Blake 7. And that explains a lot about the early design phases of Galaxy Black right there. Blake 7 plus In Search Of. Okay. At any rate. But, and this kind of taps into something I'd done many years ago in the prehistory, the Stone Age prehistory of the late 1980s, where for various reasons I started a Supers game, got overwhelmed, didn't like the rules much, wanted more to play than to run it, handed it off to some friends who were much more, at that point, versed in Supers and comic books and so on. And after many years of this becoming our default campaign game thing that we did, in true Round Robin style, it came back to me, and so I kind of wound up running the last chapter of it, weirdly. And so and I was a much better GM at that point, among other things, and for whatever reason, I decided I needed a rationale for this, and so I worked one out. And my rationale, basically, the riff I wanted to put on the world of the Supers world that we had created, because it wasn't based off of Marvel or DC. It was our own thing. We started what was in the rulebook we were using, which was Building Vigilantes. We started what was very little in the rulebook there, and then we just went off on our own, using some of the stuff in the source books, but usually repurposing it. But the rationale I came up with to kind of give me a through line to run the thing and to just make it a little more distinctive than just a generic comic book for colored universe was basically that all of this New Age stuff, in this universe, it all works. It all works as advertised on the tin. To just kind of establish the level of reality we're talking about. Now that wound up coming in handy later. As it so happens, my riff on this created, even after the campaign folded, a recurring thing that some of the players in that game kept kind of bringing my games back to. But eventually I have this whole foundation of setting lore based on kind of 19th century spiritualism, early takes on psychic powers, magic, and so on, and then kind of running with that. A key to this was an Omni article that my friend T.R. Williams found when we were in high school from 1984, which described stuff that I later encountered in the form of the movie Those Who... What is the name of it? The Men Who Stare at Goats? Something like that. Weird, great movie, but actually based on some very wacky crap that was paid for during the Reagan administration to create, to quote the Omni article, what little I remember of it directly, hyperspace nuclear howitzers. Yeah, that's a phrase that's got to linger in the subconscious, you know? But anyway, so I had this whole sort of rationale for metaphysics and stuff that kind of worked on this sort of pile of New Age and very theoretical physics. And eventually I started reading David Bohm, and it just kind of tied the room together. Eventually, long story short, I ran too late. I ran a bunch of other games in this setting, and tremendous lore was generated, and I probably 6 or 7 different game systems. And then I shelved it. I was done with it. So we get back to the modern, and originally Galaxy of Black didn't have a setting. I think I mentioned this earlier. I wanted to keep it as setting free as possible, and the extended setting that was in Galaxy of Black in the 6 books was by intention just the extrapolation of the elements presented working together or working on top of DCC assumptions, etc. So, you know, to a certain extent, they were literally examples. And obviously, I call this out many times, you don't have to use them. But as things went on, and I wrote more about this, and the sub-ethers came out, and details and games run, I started incorporating stuff from that in the finest Lake Geneva tradition. Eventually, it hit a threshold. I'm like, okay, this is definitely a setting. And it had been a setting in my head for some time, but you know, until Galaxy Black was out, I was very reluctant to do anything setting-wise. Also, for a lot of the first couple of years of Dreaming Gynoid's existence, for some reason, and I'm not actually sure why, I had this weird pathological fear of turning into White Wolf. I don't want to unpack that necessarily because it'll make people feel bad, but whatever. I've gotten over that, but I was very reluctant to just write setting material for whatever reason, even though that brings me a lot of joy. So somewhere in here in the 2013, 2014, 2015 era, we have a soup of lots of things going on, both personally and kind of in the creative area. And I've got the DCC enthusiasm going, and I still have all this unused game material that I've recycled a couple times from Universal into a failed Starships and Spacemen game. Which also created more material that I didn't get a chance to use, and you know that sits there. And at some point, I just was like, why don't I just make? I just realized I had this burning need to do kind of OSR science fiction stuff, and so I was like, why don't I just do that? Why don't I just do that? Why don't I just do that? And I swear, the moment I asked myself that question, and I'm blanking even on what it was called. Oh, I feel like an idiot. The kind of Star Wars themed sci-fi version of Swords and Wizardry came out, and I'm like, okay, and that was like the gauntlet was thrown down. Because at that point I felt like, okay, well, obviously other people are you know, in the new sphere are kind of feeling this, so I need to move quickly. Well, unfortunately, moving quickly is not really something I'm very good at. And that has actually worked to my detriment, because every single point where I got further along on the process of creating Galaxy Black, I swear it was like every single person I knew in a design space that I had any actual connection to proceeded to release science fiction material along Sometimes very similar lines, and it caused me a lot of uncertainty. Um, and then, as just to address this, uh, if I remember correctly,